and welcome back to Colorado Politicking. I'm Pat Poblete, a legislative reporter with Colorado Politics. And this week we have a fabulous panel that's going to go around the horn at the federal, the state, and then at the local level here in Denver to bring you some of this week's biggest news. So let's start off at the top there. Let's start at the federal level. And we're going to bring back on judicial reporter Michael Karlik. Michael, you joined us last week. I believe you have some updates for us this week. What's going on in the court system?
Well, Pat, big news out of Washington, D.C. as President Joe Biden has nominated longtime public defender Veronica Rossman to the vacant seat from Colorado on the federal appeals court that covers our state and our states. Now, the circuit courts of appeal are important because they clarify the law for the lower courts, and given the tiny number of cases the U.S. Supreme Court takes on each year, most appeals end up at the circuit level. Now, Veronica Rossman has been with the public defender's office here for 10 years, and progressive groups have generally applauded the nomination because, as you might know, the judicial bench is consisting mostly at this point of prosecutors and attorneys who are in private practice. So to have a public defender, the only public defender on the 10th Circuit, is kind of a big deal for us. Now, speaking of the 10th Circuit, Colorado was also in the news this week as all of the judges in a rare hearing considered whether to keep alive the lawsuit that challenges the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR. Now, the judges heard from the school districts, the Boulder County commissioners, and the one special district who argue that they have standing to sue to declare TABOR unconstitutional based on the original law that made Colorado a state. Now, that law from 1875 guaranteed that we have a, quote, Republican form of government. The lawyers for the plaintiffs backed down when the judges suggested they had enough information to decide what a Republican form of government is, and instead the plaintiffs say that matter should be gone back to the district court for further fact-finding. Now, for the record, the plaintiffs think that a Republican form of government means one in which a small group of representatives makes decisions for the much larger population. TABOR, of course, by divesting the state legislature and local legislative bodies of the authority to tax and spend, infringes on that right, they say. Now, Pat, I thought an interesting moment came right here when Chief Judge Timothy Timkovich asked the lawyer for the plaintiffs, Sarah Mercer, is it all of Colorado's democracy, ballot initiatives, and referenda that you have a problem with? And she answered, no, it's just TABOR because of its unique circumstances.
And I don't think you're challenging direct democracy as a concept, you know, the initiative process in Colorado, are you?
No, this case is not an attack on the right to the citizen initiative. It really is a question of where the boundary lines are.
So, Pat, we will expect a decision in the coming weeks on that
and
case.
Michael, we'll know you'll stay on top of it because you are busy as ever. And if you don't believe me in that, go ahead and go to the Colorado Politics website and have a look at the courts tab to see just how much Michael puts out. It's really incredible. And speaking of incredible production, let's kick it over to Marianne Goodland, Colorado Politics Chief Legislative Reporter. And Marianne, you and I have certainly had a lot to do this week. We've seen bills on guns, we've seen bills on vaccines, we've seen bills on charter schools, as well as direction from the federal level as to how to spend some of that stimulus money. So what really stood out for you this week at the State House?
First of all, we had two of the three bills on guns that were introduced in the wake of the Boulder King Super shooting that went through committee this week. The first was House Bill 1299, which creates the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And that went through a House committee on a party line vote last week. The second one, and the one that I think is the most controversial of all of them, is on the bill that lifts what's known as preemption. And what preemption means is that a local government cannot pass a law on gun control that is stricter than what's in state statutes. This would allow local governments to do exactly that. The impact that has gun rights advocates the most upset deals with concealed weapons permits and concealed carry. And this also would allow local governments to bar concealed weapons. The issue here is that a Boulder judge, 10 days before the March 22nd shooting in Boulder, overturned a Boulder City resolution that banned assault weapons in Boulder. And while the bill's sponsors say this would not have stopped the shooter in the King Super's shooting, they still want to let governments have their own say. Opponents of this bill say that this is going to create a very confusing patchwork of gun resolutions or gun control resolutions across multiple jurisdictions, whether it's cities, counties, even special districts. Imagine your local water district saying you can't bring a gun into the water district office, which is one of the things that the opponents of this bill brought up. The other thing that's been really, really interesting this week is on those federal guidelines regarding the spending of the American Rescue Plan. Colorado is going to get $3.8 billion. This is going to be the largest pot of one-time money the state's ever seen. And that money has to be spent in 4 years. So lawmakers are not exactly in a big rush to make a decision about how to spend it. The guidelines allowed it to be spent on things like water, sewer, broadband, affordable housing, housing assistance, food assistance. There's even a section that I found particularly interesting, which is to provide premium payments to essential employees who have had to put their lives at risk during the pandemic. This could be healthcare, grocery stores, schools, those kinds of things. The checks to the state of Colorado are going to come in two forms. The first one, about half of it will show up sometime in the next 60 days. The second one will come in March of next year. So lawmakers who have just 3 weeks left in this session are trying to decide just how much can they get done before the session ends. Do they need to come back for a special session? Some say yes, some say no. And how much do they push off into the 2022 session? So stay tuned.
And from the State House, let's go to my house, in a sense, and let's bring in Hannah Metzger, who is a city government reporter for the Denver Gazette. And Hannah, I live right down here by the Pepsi Center, and I have to tell you, I see these e-scooters just all over the place. And as I understand it, the Denver City Council is actually going to take some steps towards kind of regulating those. So tell us what you can about that.
Well, anyone who's ever been to downtown Denver has definitely noticed the rentable e-scooters that have absolutely taken over the sidewalks in the last year. This week, the Denver City Council passed 2 bills that will completely change the way e-scooters and bikes operate in the city. For one, the only scooter companies that will be allowed in Denver are Lyft and Lime. They'll each get 1,500 scooters and 300 bikes that have to be distributed evenly throughout the city, with at least 30% operating in neighborhoods like 5 Points in East Colfax, where residents have lower rates of car ownership and higher rates of public transit use. The new system will also be super strict about scooter and bike parking. Lyft and Lime will be setting up hundreds of charging stations and parking squares for the vehicles to go when they're not being used. And there are some super harsh consequences for when scooters and bikes are parked in the wrong place. If a company gets 10 parking violations within 90 days, their fleet will be cut by 10%. If they get 25 violations in 180 days, their operating license will be suspended for 20 days. All of these changes are expected to begin in the coming weeks. The city says there will be around 100 new parking stations within 6 months.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to seeing a few less of those scooters around, Hannah. So thank you for coming on, bringing us those updates. Also, thanks to Marianne and Michael. Insightful as ever. For all 3 of our guests this week, I'm Pat Poblete. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again next week.